Okay, and we're live. Welcome back, everybody. Hello, and it's so good to see you all today. It's that time of, well, it's actually not that time of the week again, Jared. We're going live on a different day this year, aren't we? At least we're trialing it.
Well, yeah, we're going to trial Wednesdays, Mary Ellen, just because the Thursday is a sort of a deadline day for record, and it's a bit hard with you and I both adjusting our roles a little bit this year to squeeze that in on the Thursday afternoon. So yeah, there's lots of changes, lots of exciting things. We've launched a new design of record earlier this year. But we'll bring all that to you as you're following our channels. We don't need to spend a lot of time because we've got heaps to talk about with Pastor Marcos today.
Absolutely. And Pastor Marcos Torres is joining us all the way from Perth, WA. Marcos, thank you so much for being here.
I'm stoked. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It's an honor. So before we dive into the topic of today, which is so relevant, just tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a local church pastor, but you're also an author, and what your day-to-day looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm a local pastor here in Perth. Been here for 6 years now, I think, something like that, unless I'm miscounting in my head, which happens often. So I'm a local pastor here. This year I'm working with the Joondalup Community Church up in Joondalup, and also a church plant out of the Coburn region where I live. I have a wife who is studying psychology and counseling right now, so that's really cool. And 2 boys as well. And I'm originally from New Jersey, so I'm a Jersey boy. My parents are from Puerto Rico. I think I'm the only Puerto Rican in all of Western Australia, but we don't usually travel this far. But here I am. Yeah, so I've written a few books over the years. Interestingly, it's just hasn't really been because I sat down and said I'm going to write a book. I just wrote articles and things that I put together that God was putting on my heart. And over time, it just, there was enough there that I was like, hey, we can make this a book. So there you go. Yeah.
And how many
question.
Written now?
Sorry,
just to clarify, how many books?
I think 4 or 5. I can't even remember. So I recently released the Bible study Set the Road, which I would really consider my first official like book, because that was very intentionally designed. The others, like I said, were articles that became books, and I think there's 4 of them. Yeah.
Just speaking about your heritage and stuff, Marcos, you said you might be the only guy in the whole of WA. What is it that you miss about home, be it America or Puerto Rico, or your culture, your heritage? What's the one thing that you really miss?
Yeah, well, I definitely miss Puerto Rican food. That's for sure. Yeah, it's not the healthiest, but it's so good. It's so good, man.
What are we looking at? What are we talking?
It's Puerto Rican food is not. It has not been sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It hasn't been popularized, like, for example, Mexican food. So there's a lot of dishes that are Puerto Rican that you kind of probably never heard of. There's no restaurant that you can go to and, kind of get them. Like anywhere you go in the world, you can get yourself a taco, But Puerto Ricans, we have some dishes like tostones, alcapurrias, things like that. Like you're probably like, what? You kind of have to be somewhere where there's lots of Puerto Ricans who have the proper ingredients to make the stuff to eat it. It's not sort of commodified. Like some other cultures are able to sort of get their food all over the globe. Ours is a little bit more underground.
Okay.
Yeah.
More exclusive.
But it's really good. It's really good. Yeah.
Hope to one day be able to try that. Oh, it sounds so good.
You will not regret it.
I love Mexican food, so it's kind of similar. Marcos, on your website, so your website is thestorychurchproject.com.
Yep.
And in your about page, it says, over the last 5 years, I've been working tirelessly to nurture an approach to Adventist mission that is effective in our emerging secular post-church cultures. Wow, what a statement. What an impressive goal. It's one that I think a lot of Christians, a lot of Adventists actually don't have. And we can get into that later. But before we sort of delve into that topic, we wanted to sort of clarify what we're actually talking about, because there's a lot of labels that go around. There's like, postmodern, post-Christian, secular, millennial. How do you define your audience? Like, what is it we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I want to answer the question for today. So my audience for today, I want to direct this at people who are listening to this who've never thought about or interacted with this stuff before. So if you're a guru in this space, I'm going way back to the basics here, because I think it's probably more practical for, for us to get back to those basic ideas. So I want to start with an example that will probably help clarify kind of what I'm doing. Okay. So there's a book called Peace Child, I believe is the name of the book. Have you guys ever heard of it?
I have. Is it
Yeah,
Papua New Guinea?
Yes.
The guy goes into a remote tribe and he struggles to contextualize the gospel, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So most of us are probably familiar with missionaries like that who go into foreign lands where it's very difficult to contextualize the gospel in a way that makes sense to the tribes and the people who've inhabited that space for many decades. So in this particular storyline, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but in this particular storyline, when the missionaries arrived there and begin to, share the stories of Jesus, one of the issues that they encountered was in this particular tribe, some things like betrayal, being conniving, being sneaky. They were seen as virtues. They were seen as if you know how to be manipulative enough to betray someone and get ahead, then you're the good guy. Like that's actually a virtue in their culture. So when they're reading the stories of Jesus, obviously Judas emerges as the good guy in the story. And they really struggle to contextualize the gospel, because what you're dealing with here is a group of people who have categorized reality in a way that is contrary to the way in which we're used to communicating the gospel. And so obviously what these missionaries had to do, which is what every missionary on the face of the earth for all of history has ever had to do, is listen intently, observe intently the culture, really inhabit the way that they think, the way that they see the world, they see reality, and then find those bridges that can help them bring the gospel across. And so in this particular story, one of the key bridges is that there was a tradition among those tribes in that region that when one tribe was at war with another or had offended another tribe, the one of the tribes would offer a child to the other one. And they would say, look, we'll give you this child to raise as your own. And the child is a peace child, right? It's because we've given you this child to raise as your own, there's now peace between our tribes and there's no more war between us, but we'll never have anything to do with this child again. He's yours, right? And so that became one of the key bridges that Christ is God's peace child for humanity. So anyways, that's, I wanted to start that out because I feel like we all kind of get mission work. We get missionaries, we get mission stories, and we hear stories like this. But the interesting thing that I've found over the years is that as open and as excited as we tend to be about hearing these amazing stories of the gospel being contextualized to these foreign tribes and villages and nations, we struggle to do it in our own backyard. We struggle to realize that the world that we presently inhabit in the Western culture is so far removed from the world that existed when Adventism was born. And it's so far removed from the world that existed even when we were born that that we fail to see the need and the urgency of contextualization in our own backyard. And so that's kind of my passion. I spent 4 years in the Army, and it was the first time I left home, right? I was brought up in a conservative Adventist church on the East Coast of America, a Latino Seventh-day Adventist church. And that world that I was brought up in was sort of a bubble. And when I joined the Army and I started meeting people from different walks of life and different places, had guys from all different states that I'd never visited. And I started to realize, like, wow, they think really different from me, and they see the world totally different from me. And they ask questions I never thought of. And it's deeper than just they have different beliefs. It's much deeper than that. It's the way in which they arrive at beliefs and the way in which they categorize them is different as well. And so I realized, like, man, if I'm ever going to get across to these guys about why I have faith in Jesus, then I have to listen really intently and adapt and contextualize what I'm saying so it makes sense in their heads, you know.
Mm.
So anyways, yeah, so that's my passion. That's the passion behind that statement, Mary Ellen. It's just this desire to say, here's the world that we inhabit now. And I can talk about that a little bit more with some of those phrases that I use, like post-church and stuff. But here's the world that we inhabit now. It's so far removed from any semblance of traditional historic Christian categorization. And so if I'm going to give Jesus, if I'm going to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, then I have to listen really deeply to this world that we inhabit and find those bridges, contextualize, adapt the message so it makes sense to them. Yeah.
Mm. Because I guess in the West, Marcos, so what you're kind of saying is we've come from a community, a culture that was fairly Christian. So the church was the center of the community in the villages in, you know, in America, in England. This was the sort of important part of culture, and our laws and things came out of some of those things. And now we're in a world that looks very different from that, but perhaps the church hasn't updated that communication, the language, the style, the modes, because we still assume that everybody sort of understands the basic premise of the gospel. And yet perhaps more like these remote foreign tribes, perhaps people don't understand the basic premise of the gospel, and yet we assume that they do. Would you say that there's a low amount of understanding out there in the community, or they've just already rejected it, or do they not know at all with some of the people that we're dealing with?
It's a beautifully complex mixed bag.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right, man. You hit the nail on the head. There was a time where if you were not a Christian and you did not attend church, you still categorize reality along Christian lines. The world was very Christian, particularly the Western world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'll give you an example from my own backyard in New Jersey, where I was growing up, Latino culture. You, as the pastor, would walk down the street of your church, and the local drunkard would see you and hide his bottle. Mm-hmm. He never went to church. He never read his Bible, right? But he saw you as the man of God, and he'd be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Pastor. You know, how are you doing today?" You know, he'd hide his bottle, or you'd go to work and you know, your friends are cussing up a storm in the cafeteria as they're eating lunch, and then you walk in, "Oh, you know, Jared's here. He's a Christian. Just cut the cursing out." You know, like the people were not necessarily going to church or proclaiming any sort of allegiance to Christianity or Jesus, but they still kind of saw the world along those categories. Whereas now it is, here's the bottom line. We have to realize as Seventh-day Adventists, as Christians in this milieu that we inhabit now, that whether we like it or not, we are missionaries. We are missionaries in a completely foreign world. The world isn't what it used to be. It's changed so much. And so, yeah, we are missionaries, and missionaries have the responsibility to study the culture. Missionaries have the responsibility to contextualize the message to the culture. You don't go as a missionary and expect them to learn English so that you can preach the gospel to them, right? You learn their language. You translate the Bible into their language. And so you have to learn their language. And there is a new language that we as Christians need to learn to speak to our Western neighbors. You have to learn their way of seeing the world. You don't demand they see it your way. You have to learn theirs. You have to find those bridges. We're missionaries. And I think that's the basic premise of everything that I'm trying to say is, like, you know, sometimes people say, "Oh, Marcus, this is such a radical idea." I'm like, it's not radical. It's ancient. Missionaries have been doing this for so long. There's nothing radical about it. We just tend to not do it in the West. And so it seems radical here, but it's so old, you know? And so, yeah, does that fully answer the question?
I think so. We got a comment here from Dan Jones. He says, "Talk about anything today, but you can talk about anything today." I think he means, but talk about God and you're labeled. Do you think there's negativity against Christians and against God, or ignorance and or both? You know, what's the sort of, you may not be able to give a percentage, but what are we dealing, you know, in your experience, have you come across ignorance or hostility or what sort of mix there is out there?
Yeah. So in my experience, I've come across them all. And I think, let me back up a little bit here and paint a what's the word I'm looking at? Let me map like a picture. And, obviously anytime you map things, you lose nuance. So nothing that I'm saying here is, take it with a grain of salt. You have to immerse yourself in the conversation and really study deeply to get all the nuances. But if I go into that now, we'll be here for 5 hours. So, I'll map the narrative instead. And here's the way that I generally map it when it comes to people who have not considered this conversation before. If you go to like, I don't know, let's think before the French Revolution, let's think about the world then. The world, at least the Western world, was deeply, as you mentioned earlier, deeply centralized in Christianity, in the church, to the degree that you couldn't do anything without the church being involved somehow, right? You wanted to buy land, you wanted to get married, like there was no secular institution. Like the church basically was the center of everyone's consciousness, everyone's existence, everyone's practice in culture. And so during this time, it's sort of been labeled by philosophers as the pre-modern era. And what they mean by that is that this was an era in which people saw truth. Truth was a thing to be found in the church, in the priest, in the sacred text. So whatever truth is, it's found there. And so this is why, again, even in a world, even among people who did not subscribe to Christianity, like the local drunkard, he would see the priest and hide his bottle, right? He would see the pastor and sort of apologize and be respectful. He's like, hey, here's a man of God. So this was sort of the pre-modern era. But when you had, and look, again, I'm mapping here, I'm going quickly. But when you had culture shift and you had things like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and also you had things like the French Revolution, all of these different things happening at the same time, there was a massive shift in the culture. And so people began to move away from truth is found in religion to truth is found in rational thought or science, the scientific method, right?
Right.
And so science became the center or the place in which truth was to be found. And it promised a utopia, it promised like, we keep making progress. We keep understanding our world. We keep understanding the universe, and, medicine is improving, technology is improving. We're going to create a utopia through the scientific revolution. And so people no longer turn to God or to the priest or to the church as the source of truth. The culture began to trend toward scientific method as the source for truth. And there's a reason for that, by the way. When you go back to the pre-modern era, where the church was seen as the source of truth, the church was also incredibly oppressive. And there were wars and there was injustice, terrible injustices that were, promulgated in the name of the church. And it also withheld progress. Like you can think back to, what's the name here? Was it Copernicus? I can't remember the exact name. The guy who realized that the earth is not at the center of the universe, was that Copernicus?
Galileo, I think
Galileo. Yeah, that's right. And like the church, tried to bury it and excommunicate him, so there's this sense in which religion is this oppressive system that prevents human progress. And if we're ever going to achieve a better society, a better civilization, we have to get rid of that. And so the scientific revolution promises that liberation. And so this is what begins to take center stage. And you had the French Revolution that kind of limited or severely impacted the authority of like the church and the papacy and things like that. So people began to move toward science. And again, science promised this amazing sort of, hey, the world's going to get better. And then you had World War I. And then you had World War II, and the same science that promised this utopia was used to create the atomic bomb, and, this sort of nuclear age. And for the first time in human history, the potential, the idea, the conceptualization that we can annihilate ourselves emerged in people's consciousness. Like prior to that, the idea that we could literally destroy the entire planet and every semblance of life on it was not entering people's minds. I mean, maybe there was a few prophetic weirdos out there who thought that would someday be possible, but you're not going to catapult the earth into destruction, right? With bows and arrows, And so the atomic bomb is like this thing that really, it's like, whoa, what have we created? And so the enthusiasm of modernity, which is what's used to refer to the scientific revolution and all that stuff. You had pre-modernity, then you had modernity. So the enthusiasm that modernity promised, now you had a whole new generation looking at that enthusiasm and saying, religion failed us, science failed us. Religion promised truth, it gave us oppression. Science promised truth, it gave us destruction. Maybe the problem is we keep chasing truth. Maybe there's no such thing as truth. And so this is where you began to have the age of postmodernism emerge. And postmodernism is marked by cynicism. It's a cynical view of humanity and the human and our future, because everything's failed us, right? Our greatest institutions have failed us. Our greatest promises have failed us. Our greatest advancements have failed us. And so you can't turn to religion for truth. You can't turn to science for truth. There is no truth. And part of this idea that there is no truth wasn't simply rooted in things like the atomic bomb, for example. It was rooted in these ideas like, if you go back to not just World War II, but even before then, to like the Civil War era, where you had these beliefs that were supposedly defended by science, that people from Africa were less evolved than people from Europe, right? And that these claims of absolute truth were just inventions of empire to oppress people. And so absolute truth became synonymous with oppression. And so you could sort of do away with that. And so that's where postmodernism sort of began to kick in and grow and impact the cultural consciousness. There's no such thing as truth, and everyone, just do what works for you, and et cetera, et cetera. And so by the time that this is going on, it's not only the general culture that's changing, it's politics that's changing. Politics moves from like this Christianized sort of ethic to a post-Christian ethic, to a very secular ethic. And man, I'm mapping so many complicated things here, but I guess the main point that I'm trying to say is like there's these massive shifts in the way people are perceiving reality.
Yeah.
And then from the 1980s, even up until today, there's been another massive shift taking place in what's called metamodernism, where it's like there's this, the cynicism of postmodernism. We've discovered that it's unlivable. Like, yeah, we're not heading anywhere good, and there's no positive future, and blah blah blah. But we can't live that way. We gotta recover some sense of enthusiasm. And so people are searching for some sense of enthusiasm. But guess what? They're not going to go back to religion because we've already tried that. Right. And what did that give us? It gave us the Crusades and the Inquisition, and and before you think I'm only talking about Catholicism's influence here, Protestantism spilled a lot of blood as well. So people are going back to ancient myths, and they're going back to pagan cosmologies, and they're going back to a sense of enchantment in the universe. Sort of there's a resurgence of mystical ideology and mystical pursuit. And so that's the kind of the world that we inhabit now. But the thing is, when modernism gave way to postmodernism and postmodernism gave way to metamodernism, it's not like history is like these neat little blocks. Like here, modernists existed here, and then the postmodernists and then the metamodernists. It's like right now the culture that we inhabit is a mixed bag of all of those. And so the best way to define the world we live in today, and this is only in reference to the Western mind, right? I'm not even talking about multiculturalism, which adds another layer, right? If we're just thinking of the Western mind, we inhabit a world that is extremely fragmented in terms of how do you approach reality, right? It's extremely fragmented. And so, yeah, like you might encounter a secular person who has more modernist leanings. They believe that science is the absolute source of truth and religion's a bunch of hogwash. And they challenge you on, do you believe God is real? And what about evolution? And what evidence do you have that the Bible is reliable? Those are typically modernist questions. Postmodernists don't ask those questions though.
Right.
They're not interested in your arguments for the existence of God, or your evidence on whether the Sabbath is the seventh day or not, because it doesn't interest them. They're not looking for evidential discourse or propositional ideas. And so their questions are usually a lot more existential and deal with much different topics. And I can get into that a little bit later. I'll share some stories. And even with metamodernism and the rise of re-enchantment, there's this perennial idea that really resists the notion that any one group of people have a claim to truth or a claim to God, right? And so this is so different. Like if you go back to like the 1920s, or the 1910s, or even the 1950s, and you talk to people back then and how they perceive reality. Obviously, the world had a lot of sin and secularity back then as well, but it's so much different today. And the tragedy is that a lot of our approaches to explaining the gospel and explaining the three angels' messages or expressing truth are constructed in a environment that was primarily Christian, and we haven't updated that.
Right.
And so we are communicating to a world that no longer exists. And so that's the tragedy, because we're missionaries, and it's not the world's job to figure out what we're saying. It's our job to translate.
Yeah. Marcos, that is, I feel like every Adventist needs to just cut the last 5 minutes or 3 minutes, how long you just spoke for, and just like listen to that on repeat, because that was fantastic. And like the amount of intellect you have about history and stuff. Wow. That was, thank you for sharing that.
Oh, it was super awkward because I mapped so much, and I can hear if there's any historians listen to this, they're cringing right now. And I just want you to know I'm cringing too. It's just, I had to do it in a nutshell.
I'm not cringing. I'm anything but a historian. And I suppose to speak a little less intellectually and a little more intuitively, from what you were saying, you mentioned that the world has become very fragmented. There are all these individualistic mentalities. And I suppose with that, I see it on social media. I see it in group talk, group think. There's like this herd mentality. So the most popular idea is the one that gets promoted, and people kind of follow after this thing and then they follow after that thing. And it's kind of like, cancel culture and all of this stuff just kind of happens because of that, I think. So how can, becoming a little bit more practical, are there any tools that we can use as Christians, as Adventists? Does the church provide tools to actually speak into that? And because it's going to keep changing, right? We can't just learn something now because tomorrow it's going to be irrelevant. What are those overarching principles of communication, or I don't know, that you use, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a good point there, by the way. By the time Adventism started talking about postmodernism was already old news.
Oh, well.
Well, I feel like we talk about it a lot now, Marcos, but you're saying that's post-war, that's 75 years ago, that
pretty much,
after the atomic bomb. So we're grappling with postmodernism, but there's other things in the world that we're not even thinking through, other worldviews, and we're not even ready to address those yet. So it's a challenge.
And even in my own space, when I, for example, if I release a podcast or I promote, even my Bible study set, where, in the sort of the advertising or the marketing, I'll say designed for postmoderns. I only use the term postmoderns because if I write meta moderns, no one's going to buy it because they're like, what in the world is that? Not interested, So I have to use the term postmoderns. But yeah, it's like we're so far behind that you kind of have to tweak the language, date it back a few decades. Anyways, let me answer your question, Mary Ellen. So practical tips. Wow, there's a lot of different directions I can go here. I've written a lot and recorded a lot on this topic. In fact, if you go to the Story Church podcast, there is a whole series I did titled Understanding the Secular Mind. That will go into a lot more detail than I can go in here, because I did like 8 episodes or something like that. So, and they're like an hour each. So you can just imagine, I've only got a few minutes here. So let me just give some really basic ideas. So the bottom line is, the moment you realize you're a missionary, the moment you realize you inhabit a culture that doesn't think the way you think, that doesn't perceive or categorize reality the way you're used to, then that calls you into an adventure or into a journey of understanding. And so the very first thing I say to people is, if you really want to connect with people meaningfully, with secular modern people meaningfully, and even that term secular irritates me because it's more post-secular than anything. But anyways, if you want to connect with people in your sphere of influence who are far removed from any semblance of historic Christianity, the very first step is understanding, right? That's the very first step. When a missionary enters a foreign land, the very first thing they have to do is learn their language. And we have a language to learn. And because language isn't just merely linguistic, language is communicating the inner being, right?
Sure.
There's a language of being, and then there's a conceptual language. And so, yes, we have to update our conceptual language, but more fundamentally, we have to update our language of being. And that only happens when you actually sit down with people and listen to them intently. And so, yeah, I'll give you guys an example. So I worked with a doctor some years ago. He was from Sydney. He was in his 30s. This was before I became a pastor. I was working for Dial a Doctor. Do you guys have Dial a Doctor over East? No, it's like this doctor home service, you call them. So anyways, I was the driver and I did the doctor's paperwork. So this guy was from Sydney, and I worked there for about 3 months, and then the WA conference was like, hey, we're going to hire you, because Terry Johnson was here. And, you know, thank God there was a crazy American here who was like, I'll give that weird guy with the interesting surname a shot. So Terry Johnson had, you know, really contacted me and said, hey, look, the WA conference would like to offer you a position. So I go back to this, you know, doctor during one of our shifts, and I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be here much longer. Because I got a position working for the church. I studied theology and to be a pastor. So that's what I'm going to go do. And he looks at me, he's like, what's a pastor?
Wow.
And I was like, I'm ready for this.
Yeah.
I have heard the stories about Australian secular people. So I had like a preset template on how I would respond to that kind of question, because I anticipated it. And I'd only been in Australia maybe 4 months at the time. And my template was, I'll tell them I'm like a chaplain, but instead of a hospital, I work at a church. Well, that didn't work very well, because I told him I'm like a chaplain, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, what's a chaplain?
Wow.
And I was like, wait a minute, you're a doctor and you used to work in the emergency department. There's no way you don't know what a chaplain is. And he says to me, well, I've seen them walking around, so I'm familiar with the title, but I don't know what in the world they do. And so then I keep talking to him, and I find out this guy, he's never set foot in a church. He's never thought about setting foot in a church.
Wow.
In fact, if he drives by your church, he won't even notice it's there. And so it reminds me of a line in Roger Hernandez's book. Which one was it? Everyone Welcome, I believe is the name of the book, where he says there was a time where people were angry at the church, but now they don't even know it exists.
Yeah.
Wow.
So in the modern era, you had a lot of like the new atheists, right? You had like this animosity toward institutional religion and this hatred and anger of religion. And you still find that in some pockets in the culture. But generally speaking today, people aren't angry at the church. They just are indifferent to it. It's not even a bleep on their radar. So this guy, his entire life, he'd never set foot in a church. He'd never thought about going to church. He went to university. He did some stripping to make some extra money, you know, and now he's a doctor, and he's in a new city because he was from Sydney. He's here with his family in a new city. And the last thing on their radar is anything that's even remotely resembling church or Christianity, but he still had spiritual hunger.
Mm-hmm.
But when he thought about where do I find the answers to these questions or the solution to the spiritual hunger, the church wasn't on the radar. So it didn't even emerge as, you know, a thing to even try. And so that's part of what we're dealing with here is that, yes, you'll find some people who are antithetical to Christianity and angry about it. Sometimes people have church hurt and they've left the church and, you know, have become quite secular, and they have sort of this toxic background that they associate with Christianity. But you'll also find an increasing number of people who just don't really even think about us. And when your flyer comes in the mail, it just goes in the bin and doesn't cross their mind, you know. And when your advertisement comes up on Facebook for your Christmas program, it's like, meh, you know, it's, yeah. So I don't remember what the initial question was and how I got onto that, but I think the point I'm making here is, you know, we're so far removed. And so how do you reach this type of person? How do you connect with someone who has spiritual hunger, but is so categorizes reality so differently from you? So the very first thing I would say, practical tip, because that was the original question, practical. The very first thing I would say that I've discovered is when it comes to sharing truth, when it comes to communicating our message as Adventists, we have to understand what people are saying. We have to understand how they think, how they categorize reality. And then we have to take that understanding and we have to contextualize our message to it. Mm-hmm. But it's not simply our message that we have to contextualize, it's also our approach. So here's an example. The traditional approach to giving Bible studies assumes a top-down posture.
Mhm.
So what that means is it assumes a teacher and a student.
Right.
It assumes that one person has the knowledge and one person is receiving the knowledge. It doesn't work with postmodern, etc. Type people, because it kind of has this air of, this guru flavor to it, of you've got all the answers and I'm just supposed to take them in, and this is a problem not only with our posture, with how we teach scripture or how we teach our message, but even some of the ways in which our Bible study sets are framed. They're framed with leading questions.
Right.
And so what this means is when you read the question on the study set, the question is framed in a way that already assumes the answer.
Yeah.
So it's a top-down posture,
It drives me crazy. The
Yeah,
Sunday school lesson, the leading questions in the Bible studies, I just read it and go,
yeah. It assumes the answer before you've even looked up the, before you've even looked up the question. And so it frames the question in a way that kind of, sorry, by the way, there's the people who clean the street, so you might hear some background noise, are just driving by. So so it assumes that posture. And the problem with emerging secular culture is that claims of absolute truth are always interpreted as oppressive. So while for an Adventist, when we talk about truth, when we talk about present truth, when we talk about absolute truth, what I hear as an Adventist is freedom from lies, freedom from deception, right? The lies of Satan. I hear enthusiasm. I hear hope. I see a light when we talk about truth. It's not like that with emerging secular culture. When you talk about truth, they see chains,
right?
Like they see a cage. Again, if you go back to, even, World War II in Germany and the way in which they use science to say, hey, these people are less evolved than everyone else. And so that justifies their mistreatment, things like that. And they use science. They had scientific journals that they could quote. And we've seen this, in many different examples. But the bottom line is, when we talk about truth, we have to understand that that word conceptually does not mean to emerging secular culture what it means to us. There's a big disconnect there. And if we don't recognize that disconnect, we think we're preaching truth without realizing that by the time it lands in the listener's ears, all they're hearing is run away. This is oppressive, And so that top-down posture doesn't work in emerging secular culture. The posture I have found, which is the posture that I use, is side-by-side posture. And what I mean by that is when someone's interested in exploring God, when someone's interested in exploring faith, I say to them, look, I don't have all the answers. I'm searching for answers as well. I'm on a journey to know God as well, just as much as you are. And let's take the journey together, right? Let's walk this journey together and let's explore who he is. And I'm looking forward to learning just as much as you are, That approach is so radically different from the, let's get together and do Bible studies and I've got these pamphlets and I'll teach you everything I know, because that approach, the side-by-side approach, assumes that you're not going to shove ideas down your throat. You're not going to annoy them with leading questions. You're not going to force them to see the world the way you do. You're simply going on a journey together. And I've found that approach significantly more successful than the previous one. Now, of course, if you use that approach, but you're not authentic with it, if you use that approach but in your head, you're like, but I'm still going to make you think like I do, it won't work. And that's the thing I love about postmodernists and really millennials and Zeds is they can smell a phony a mile away. So we're talking about the most advertised two generations ever. They can smell a sales pitch a mile away. So if you're going to be inauthentic about it and try and use that approach as a gimmick, get ready to get called out. But if you do it authentically, it's beautiful. And it's an awesome opportunity to really just journey with people and explore with people. I have more to say, but I've probably talked a lot.
It's hard and it's long. It sounds like a long-term approach. You have to journey with the person rather than just expecting, let's have a 2-week program. Let's give you all the Bible study set, and then you're ready. You're in the water. You're dunked, and you're baptized.
And thank you for saying that. That's actually what I was going to say. What I was going to add is that in this approach, you have to disavow yourself of this I'm going to study the Bible with this guy for 3 months and get him baptized.
Mm.
It doesn't, that's got to go.
Could take years.
It could take years, man. Like some people have asked me, like with the Bible study set that I published, some people have said, why is it so long? It's like 200 plus pages. And I'm like, because it assumes that you're going to be journeying with this person for 2 to 3 years. You're not trying to get through this book in 6 months. That's not the point,
It's a long-term commitment.
Absolutely. And sometimes the way we construct our Bible study sets, where it's like 1 page per doctrine,
mm-hmm.
we want to get through it quickly. It's like a conveyor belt. Like, no, man, that's not the way that that's okay if you're journeying with someone that works for. I'm not saying that it's wrong. What I'm saying is in this particular missiological context, that approach doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, Marcos, because we got a lot to get through. But
sorry, man. Yeah, go for it.
To keep it moving, like I want to play the devil's advocate a little bit here. There's some questions that have come to my mind as you've been speaking, and I'm like, I can hear the pushback already from Christian people. Some are going to say things like, "But the truth will set you free. If you just present the truth, those that want it are going to get it, and those that reject it aren't." They're going to say things like, "But to understand or to speak the language of the culture, you have to somewhat embrace that culture. You have to understand it, dabble in it. And shouldn't we be a city on a hill? Shouldn't we remove ourselves from culture and let people come to us? So we're drawing them out of culture rather than going to them, because may that not compromise our own beliefs? We have this Adventist, people might quote Ellen White about bicycles or fiction or movie cinemas, and this concept of taking ourselves away from the temptations of the culture. Some of these are devil's advocate questions, and the other question that would come in is, you talked about being a missionary, but it feels like missionaries are not cool. Like, do we have to? And this might be a very Christian answer that you can give to this one, but do we have to proselytize? Do we have to convert? Because conversion seems a dirty word in today's, post-colonial sort of era. Yes, it's been used as oppression. The missionaries were oppressive. They converted people so that they could steal their resources, basically steal their bodies and steal their homes. So I guess from one perspective, the Adventist perspective, is there dangers around this approach? Should we change the message? And from the other perspective, should we even think about converting people, or should we just live good, holy lives, let them see our good works, and then they'll be drawn to us? If we lift up Christ, everyone will be drawn to Him. So it's not about converting or being missionaries. How would you respond, just briefly, to some of those sort of spanners that I'm throwing into the
You
works?
said briefly. I'm like, dude, we could do a full episode on.
We could do plenty, and we might have to get you back. But just in a nutshell.
How much time do we have?
15.
Oh, it's up to you. 10-15 minutes. Yeah.
Oh boy. Okay. The answer to the first one might take all 10. Okay. All right. Let me do my best here. I'm just reconstructing the questions that you asked in my head. So the first one was, should we, can't we just present the truth as it is, and people will hear it if they really want the truth? The problem with that line of reasoning is that it contradicts the way Jesus did mission, and it contradicts the way Paul did mission. So we're not talking about redefining truth, right? This was the problem with a lot of the emergent church movement that attempted to redefine the Bible through the postmodern lens. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not into that. Not my scene. Reframing truth is an entirely different thing, right? So redefining truth is where you look at truth and you say, well, here's postmodernism, and we're going to rewrite the atonement, and we're going to rewrite the incarnation of Jesus. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is reframing truth is when you take the same truth, but you communicate it in a language and a framework that will actually make sense to the person who's listening. So let me give you a few basic examples from the Bible. If you go to the Bible, let's look at the Gospels, for example. You look at the Gospels, you look at Jesus. John chapter 3, Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus.
Right.
He says to Nicodemus, if you want to be saved, you have to be born again. Now, the born again framework, it's a framework of the gospel. The born again framework is the most popular framework that we use when we're preaching the gospel. Everyone talks about being born again. The interesting thing is, when you read the gospels, Jesus only used that framework one time. He never used it again. And he used it while speaking to a Jewish leader who believed that his natural birth as a descendant of Abraham was enough to get him into heaven.
Wow.
And so Jesus says to this guy who thinks my fleshly birth as a descendant of Abraham gets me into heaven, he says to him, no, actually, you have to be born again, because that birth as a descendant of Abraham doesn't count. It's the rebirth of the Spirit. Now you get to the very next chapter, and Jesus finds the woman at the well. He sees the woman at the well, and he preaches the gospel to her, and he doesn't tell her to be born again. Right? Instead, he says to her, whoever drinks this water will thirst again. But if you drink the water that I offer you, you'll never thirst again. Right. So he's preaching it's the same gospel. It's the same exact message, but he's reframed it. Why? Because the woman at the well was a Samaritan who did not have the same worldview that Nicodemus had. She was not a descendant of Abraham. And if there was some semblance of Israelite background in her, it had been amalgamated with the Assyrian blood. And so they were considered even worse than, most other pagans. And so she didn't have the same worldview. She didn't grow up believing, because I'm a descendant of so-and-so, I'm going to heaven, right? So there was no point of Jesus saying to her she had to be born again. It wouldn't have made sense. But what she did have was an existential thirst. She was searching. She was seeking for something to satisfy her heart, and she wasn't finding it. And so Jesus says to her, I'm it, right? I'm the living water. I'm what you're actually searching for, right? And so you have in the Gospels, Jesus is constantly reframing the gospel, but he's saying the same thing. He's just saying it in different frameworks. And you see the same exact thing with Paul. For example, I know there's debate over whether Paul wrote the book of Hebrews or not, but just look at the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is written to surprise the Hebrews. And the entire book is a beautiful exposition of the gospel that is built upon the Old Testament. Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than the priests. Jesus is better than the law. Jesus is better than the sanctuary, right? Like it's this entire exposition of the gospel going back into the Old Testament and showing how Jesus is greater than all of this. Now, Paul goes to Mars Hill in the book of Acts to preach to the Epicureans and the Stoics, and he never brings any of that stuff up. In fact, he alludes to the Bible, but he never quotes it. What he does quote is a pagan poet.
Wow.
And what he does say to the Athenians is, I've been going around your city. I've been observing the different idols, and I found this one altar with an inscription to the unknown God. And I'm here to tell you who the unknown God is. It's Jesus. And it's like, wait a minute, time out. I want you to understand what Paul just did there. Paul took a pagan cosmology, right, of polytheism. He did not insult the polytheism. He did not tell them, here are all the reasons why the polytheism is wrong, at least at the start. Instead, he enters into the polytheism and he tells them, here's the piece that's missing, and it's Jesus, right? And then from there, he leads them toward the truth. And so,
and also the graven image, because he's talking about an idol,
exactly,
a representation of a god. Hey, we don't know who that one is. Well, that's to cover our bases in case we missed one, right?
Yeah.
But there's this image that breaks the commandments.
Yeah.
But Paul uses that as to bring Jesus into that conversation.
Absolutely. And then toward the end of his sermon, again, he's alluding to scripture, but he's not quoting, he's not saying Moses and, the angels and the temple, because the Stoics had no idea what that stuff was. That wasn't their worldview. And then toward the end of his sermon, he quotes this pagan poet as a truth source, by the way.
Yeah.
And so what you see here is Paul is contextualizing the gospel to his listeners. Now, here's another example, last one, and then I'll move on to the next question. In the book of Acts, I can't remember the chapters, it might be 14, 15. Paul spends an entire chapter talking about how circumcision is anti-gospel. that circumcision is an insult to the cross, that the finished work of Jesus is enough, right? He's responding to the Judaizers. Circumcision is of no avail, right? Circumcision of the heart, Jesus accomplished it. That's what it's about. Because, the Judaizers were saying that, Gentiles have to be circumcised before they can become Christians. So you guys know that. So Paul spends a whole chapter basically talking about how circumcision is anti-gospel, anti-cross in this context. And then in the very next chapter, he circumcises Timothy before they go preach to the Jews.
Yeah.
What is he doing? Did he change his mind? Of course not. He knew circumcision was anti-gospel if you're doing it for the purpose of, earning favor with God. But he realized, we're going to go speak to the Jews. We can't have any stumbling block. We have to contextualize. We have to meet them where they are. So Timothy, sorry, bro. We got to get this done. And so this is contextualization, right? He didn't change his theology. He's simply meeting people where they are. And this is why Paul is, that famous line, to the Jews I became as a Jew, to the Greeks I became as a Greek, to those under the law I became as one under the law. So that, by all, paraphrasing and cutting it in pieces here, but, so that by all means I might save some. You're not going to win everyone, and it's not your job to win everyone. That's the Holy Spirit's work. But it's our responsibility, as Paul says again in the book of Acts, let's not make things difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Right? Like following Jesus, the call of Jesus is inherently challenging enough. We don't need to make it worse by adding our own cultural tidbits to it and demanding people jump through hoops that are not necessary to be jumped through in order to find Jesus. Yeah. So that was the first question. I can't remember what this
and I've heard you say, or maybe you've written, Marcus, like Adventism is beautiful. So the core, the doctrines, all the stuff, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
But we need to reframe it. What you're saying is we need to present it, in a way that people can actually understand it and engage with it.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So let me give you an example from that. Very quick one, if that's cool.
Quick.
Okay. Yeah. So early Adventism inhabits a Christian world. The vast majority of America at the time is Christian.
Yep.
And early Adventism shares many of the same beliefs with a lot of the Christians, Jesus is the savior, God, and all that stuff.
Yep.
So, and at the same time, many early Protestants, and even to this day, many classical Protestants believe that the commandments are still relevant post-cross. They haven't been done away with. And so they still keep the Sabbath. They just keep it on Sunday because of the tradition of Sunday. And so the message of Adventism is, hey, the Sabbath is not on the first day, it's on the seventh day. That's the Sabbath that God instituted, and it's a celebration of his creation. And the first day, it comes from tradition, doesn't come from scripture. And so we frame the message that way. And so you'll have in evangelistic campaigns, you'll have like that sermon titled, the change of the Sabbath, or what day is the Sabbath? Well, what happens when you inhabit a culture that no longer has any clue what the Sabbath is, or who Jesus is, or what any of this stuff has to do? What does a sermon, what day is the true Sabbath mean in that culture? It means nothing.
Right.
It means nothing, right?
It doesn't help.
You still have to preach the Sabbath, but you have to think, okay, like how can we frame it differently to people who are in a different mental space than the people back then? So anyways, example.
And it is still attractive. It is an attractive conversation.
Absolutely.
Maybe the final question, the final part of my questions that I bombarded you with was the conversion, the missionary, being a missionary. I think as Christians, we all know that we are commissioned by the gospel to preach Jesus. And that's maybe hard in this context, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So I think I'm happy to leave that for now. Maybe we can do an episode down the track on that.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
I guess to touch base on some of the stuff that you've been doing. So, big fan of Lecrae. I saw you spoke to Lecrae recently. You're doing a new podcast called The Unknown God, which links to the ideas, I guess, the reframing and the contextualizing of this stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you're doing that podcast as opposed to the Story Project? Why you're part of that project and some of the most recent things you've been doing, and where we can check out more if we want to continue this conversation.
For sure. Yeah. Look, if anyone's listening to this and they want to get the full spiel and go into detail and explore some of these topics in much more depth, thestorychurchproject.com. Got a podcast, books, blogs, it's all there. The Unknown God podcast is an amazing opportunity that God's opened up. I've got a friend here in WA. Well, he lives in Bali now, but his name is Joel Brown, and he's been really successful in the world of like mindset, business coaching, that sort of stuff. You know, sort of the Tony Robbins world. He's been really successful in that world. And he contacted me last year and said to me, what if I told you I'm really bored? And I was like, okay. And so what he's telling me is I've got all these people coming to me, you know, for coaching and, you know, life coaching and business coaching and, you know, achieve your dreams, your best life now, all that stuff. And he's working with all these clients and they keep coming back to him for more. And so he goes back to the experts to see what else he can learn from them to pass on to his clients. And he realized, like, I've reached the summit of everything this world has to offer and people are still hungry.
Wow.
And people are still thirsty. And so he decided, I need to use this platform to preach the kingdom.
Wow.
And so that's what we've done, man. Like, so we started a whole new project called The Unknown God. And so the reason why I'm stepping away from the Story Church podcast, I'm still doing the Story Church project, a lot more cool stuff coming through there. The Story Church podcast is going to start winding down, although I do still have new content coming out, including a whole series, which is the next series coming out, how to minister with the LGBT plus community. So that's going to be a really, really cool series I'm recording right now. So yeah, so that one, it's beginning to slow down because I'm a pastor and I've got churches and I can't spend all my time recording podcasts. You know, like my priority is to my churches. So I can't, you know, Story Church podcast and then this one, it's, you know, I have to sort of shut one down in order to make space for the other. So the Unknown God podcast is just that. It's not for Christians. It's not designed for church folk. It's designed to communicate the gospel, the way of Jesus, to people in the culture who are thirsting, who are searching for God, but who don't like church or who don't, you know, their brain doesn't work the way churchy people's brain works. So we just designed a whole podcast just to communicate the gospel through that Adventist lens from that perspective. So we talked to Lecrae. We did Matthew McConaughey as well recently, which was really fun. And we've got a lot more cool stuff coming up. So yeah.
Incredible.
Amazing.
Exciting times. Yeah.
Wow, Marcos, it's amazing to see all the creative things you're doing, not only creative, but also intellectually based. Like, I love it on your website, how you say everything is so theologically grounded, but it's also like progressive and it's relevant. And yeah, that's a very rare quality to see. So it's been an honor to have you on this afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, to everyone who's watching, we'll put the links to all of your content in the description or the comments below. Marcos, if you're free later, feel free to check out some of the comments. There was some to you.
Awesome.
And we will see you guys for another conversation for Record Live next week. See you then.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.